Let's go! The history of Brazil, the fifth largest country in the world, and only Portuguese-speaking country in Latin America, begins in the year 1500 with its discovery by Pedro Álvares Cabral. Portugal claimed Brazil for itself by initiating settlement at São Vicente, near present-day megalopolis São Paulo, in 1532. Like the Spanish elsewhere in South America, the Portuguese conquistadors, known as bandeirantes, dominated the primitive natives and looked to extract what they could from the countryside. Native slave labor dwindled under harsh treatment, and importation from Africa began a huge enterprise, with slaves used for sugar, coffee, and rubber production and mining. Unlike the United States, Brazil was unable to shake free of its mercantile servitude to the mother continent. The Portuguese government's Pombaline reforms of 1750 to 77 strengthened its hold on Brazil at the very moment Britain was losing its hold on America in the American Revolution. Independence did eventually come for Brazil, but without revolution. After the Portuguese monarchy had established itself in Brazil fleeing from Napoleon, the ruling family became ensconced there, preferring it to Europe. In 1822, Prince Regent Dom Pedro issued the cry of Ipiranga, "Independence or death," breaking away from Portugal. Brazil's approximation of a revolution came in 1888 with the abolition of slavery by the imperial regent Princess Isabel, which triggered the ouster of the monarchy by an alliance of landed aristocracy, merchants, and military. Without any particular ideological commitment of their own, Brazil's leaders drifted in the cultural currents of the early 20th century, especially nationalism. During World War II, the pragmatic leader, Getulio Vargas, opted to support freedom abroad while maintaining oppression at home with his so-called Estado Novo, or New State, from 1937 to 45. The inability of the political class to embrace freedom as the solution to Brazil's economic and social inequality contributed to continual political instability, which led Brazil's military to impose a stabilizing dictatorship from 1964 to 85, notoriously supported by the United States, which sought to prevent the spread of communism to Latin America. Having recovered a democratic form of government, Brazil continues to drift on cultural currents defined elsewhere, following a European mixed economy model.
Getulio Vargas, the force behind a nation, the man who was Brazil. The Brazil of Vargas's youth scarcely resembled that of his adult life. Vargas grew up the son of a wealthy and established Brazilian family, a family that descended from early Portuguese gauchos, influential agricultural ranchers who had traditionally held power in post-colonial Brazil. At age 16, Getulio Vargas followed in his father's footsteps by becoming an officer in the Brazilian army. Yet Vargas, from an early age, displayed tendencies to buck convention. In defiance of the national character of Brazil at the time, Vargas set out on a career that could not have been further from that of his ancestors. In 1907, Vargas tossed aside the prospect of a life in the military, instead opting to pursue a career in law. Vargas was never one to remain at rest. In 1909, just 2 years after completing legal study, Vargas shifted his career towards a life of public service. He began his political career as state deputy of Rio Grande do Sul. Yet it was here where Vargas encountered his first obstacles in his rise to power. Vargas labored as state deputy for 13 long years, when in 1922 he broke into the national scene by being elected federal deputy. Just 4 years later he became Minister of Finances, gaining him credibility among the populace as a voice of economic reason. Vargas knew the importance of building a strong political base from which to derive his support, and thus returned to Rio Grande do Sul to serve as its chief executive. It was from this point that Vargas began his precipitous rise to power. Over the course of only 4 years, Vargas had established himself as a prominent political figure. And then came the opportunity for him to take the nation by storm. October 29, 1929. International markets were reeling from the effects of the recent stock market crash. Export prices plummeted, and Brazil was plunged into a state of pessimism and economic. In the ensuing political turmoil, President Washington Luiz was voted out of office. Refusing to relinquish control in face of economic crisis, Luiz faced opposition from the military and political establishments. In a military coup, opponents deposed Luiz from power. The moment Vargas was waiting for had arrived.
Vargas Brazilian political figures. Foreign Minister Oswaldo Aranha, Luiz Carlos Prestes, all the greatest. Prestes, especially, was so immensely popular among the Brazilian populace that he was called the Knight of Hope. It was Vargas's personal ambition paired with his unstoppable political contacts that catapulted him straight to the top, from provincial governor to absolute ruler.
In the midst of utter chaos in the nation's capital, and with the support of Brazil's army, Getulio Vargas proclaimed himself dictator of the country. He would remain in power longer than any man in 20th century Brazilian history.
The United States experienced one of its worst stock market crashes during the year of 1929. Its devastating effects would be felt all around the world. One of the few countries that the crash affected immensely was Brazil. Prior to 1929, the country had been expanding its economy nicely through its main exports of rubber and coffee. The United States, England, and Germany were Brazil's primary trading partners. Yet, as the crash rippled through the United States, the country almost immediately was unable to purchase such exports like coffee from Brazil. In lieu, the demand for all Brazilian exports dramatically fell. In addition to these turns of events, the United States Federal Bank placed higher interest rates on the loans made to Brazil. Thus, not only was Brazil experiencing harsh repercussions from the decline in their exports, but it had to pay more on its debts. Brazil was suffering as a nation, and no one else felt this harder than the middle class.
So, Sao Paulo's growing political importance in Brazil, without the growing of any other Brazilian area, would have led many to anger. With his goal of strengthening the working class, Vargas appealed to the majority in Brazil who had been hit by the economy's downfall, and was fully supported by the military, which placed unwavering faith in his ability to restore power.
And integralism is the ideology of a nation being one unit. Many say that this ideology is a combination of leftist and right views. But again, Vargas would only incorporate these ideals, not claim to be an integralist himself. He said, perfect our manufacture to the point where it would be unpatriotic to feed or clothe ourselves with imported goods.
But he also said the policy should be shaped to support national development.
Yes, this was all shaped to pull Brazil out of its economic troubles.
Well, it does sound a lot like European fascism.
Well, it does, but Vargas himself would never admit to it. He would even be seen arresting those who would contradict him.
You know what else that Vargas guy reminds me of? That Argentinian dude, Perón.
Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, dude.
No, actually, Andrew's onto something. A lot of Perón's policies, such as the 5-year policy, encompass a lot of similar ideals.
Well, it does sound like you know a bit too much about Vargas.
I think it's better we get rid of you.
Slowly, two groups began emerging in Brazil, the Sao Paulo state and the tenants. The tenants, a group of lower military officers, wanted the military to be able to intervene in economic development, while the Sao Paulo party urged the development of constitutional rule. Though different, these two groups revolted against the provisional presidency that Vargas had stepped into, which they did not acknowledge without a constitution. Thus, the Constitutional Rebellion, later known as the Paulista Rebellion, began in 1932.
This rebellion was the first expression of dissent against Vargas's provisional presidency. Because Vargas's step into power symbolized the rising urban middle-class authority, the revolution was also an attempt to restore power by the coffee oligarchies. This war would leave 2,200 dead and cities like Sao Paulo incredibly damaged. Yet, it led Vargas to have no other option but acknowledge the need for a Brazilian constitution.
The National Constituent Assembly was assembled, bearing in mind first the legitimized presidency. This new constitution would be made on 1933 and set May 1938 as the due date for Vargas's presidential term.
This would also promote industrial growth while fighting communist influence, and attempted to lead towards a nationalistic view, with everyone working for each other. The Constitution would also make a group of government authority called the Chamber of Deputies, which would attempt to lower foreign intervention and place government authority on private businesses. Workers' rights would be changed, with the minimum wage being designated, although this would not always be followed.
In 1934, Vargas's ideals slowly began to take more of a rightist direction, with a dictatorship coming to play. though it would never be admitted. He would grow more and more fond of fascist principles, all in an effort to create his Estado Novo, or new state. This new state would be from 1937 to 1945, beginning truly when Vargas makes Brazil's new constitution. Vargas would begin imposing censorship on press and radio while abolishing political parties, with anything that might hinder his power. This would all help him towards his imposing of fascist ideals, while also helping Brazil develop what is being a key time in which urban planning would be completed. During World War II, Vargas would eventually stand on the Allied side, even sending troops called the Brazilian Expeditionary Force to fight in Italy. This fight for democracy would make Vargas seem extremely hypocritical. As a result, there was a national cry for democracy, and Vargas would soon see an interruption in his dictatorship. The war would end, but with it would come post-war sentiments for democracy. Vargas would then be forced to call elections, no longer able to extend his term in office as he had done throughout his rule. In fact, by 1945, Vargas had already extended his presidential term twice. According to the Constitution of 1937, Vargas's presidential term was due in 1943, but he had extended until 1944, claiming national uncertainties brought upon by the war. In 1944, Vargas extended elections again for another year. Now in 1945, a new election was inevitable. Therefore, he was stepped down on October 10, 1945, as the military grew restless and further urged his quick actions. He would say,
I would prefer that you all attack me and that my death remain as a protest against this violence. But as this is to be a bloodless coup d'etat, I shall not be a cause of disturbance.
Vargas was stepped down, signaling the end of the Estado Novo. Later, Eurico Caspar Dutra, who was head of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force that fought with the Allies in Italy during World War II, would come to power in support of the Social Democratic Party. Vargas would hold a place as a Senate from the Rio Grande do Sul. Of course, Vargas would eventually come to power once again.
Brazil granted the U.S. temporary space to launch fighting planes to Europe and Africa, and sent troops to be commanded by the U.S. Army. Vargas was convinced, against his admiration for Mussolini and tendency towards a dictatorship, because of Franklin Roosevelt's promise that Brazil would have a permanent place in the UN Security Council, a part of the United Nations based on working towards a national security. Despite Roosevelt's promise, Brazil was not given a place in the UN Security Council due to opposition from the Soviet Union and United Kingdom. This led towards an obvious doubt on whether the United States could be trusted. Vargas's goal to industrialize Brazil also led to anger from the United States, with foreign capital investment being opposed. This developing antagonism would temporarily change with the short period of democratic rule that would follow Vargas, though it would return to its original place once Vargas returns in 1951.
Nothing remains except my blood. I gave you my life, now I give you my death. I choose this way to defend you, for my soul will be with you. My name shall be a flag for your struggle. Serenely, I take my first step on the road to eternity, and I leave life to enter history.
Created using Powtoon.